everybody. Welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the network where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started right now. Okay, let's break this down right now. Joining me is forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I want to begin talking about this case from the brutality of it. You know, DeeDee Blanchard, and we'll get into the whole motivations and things like that, but DeeDee Blanchard was stabbed, and correct me if I'm wrong, 17 times, mostly in the back while she was asleep. What do you make from the actual crime scene?
Well, the interesting thing about it, Jesse, is that this woman was caught unawares, that there was not a lot of mobility in the dynamic at the scene, and so she's in one particular area, and also that means that the perpetrator had access to her when she was in this resting state, and he could creep in and perpetrate this crime. And that gives you kind of an insight into the dynamic that's going on in here. It implies that this was, at least to a certain degree, a planned event that he could enter in at this particular time. Maybe he was given the heads up relative to knowing when she would be in repose, if you will, and ultimately kill her.
Yeah, that's a great point, because he was charged with first-degree murder, and we are going to get into the degree of those wounds right after this break. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be back discussing the Nicholas Godejohn case. Okay, so Joseph, I want to break this down with you right now. What we're listening to is clearly a brutal crime, but what are you getting from the stab wounds? I mean, did she feel every one of these wounds? Was there one in particular you think that was the ultimate blow, or is this just a slow death?
It's a totality of the wounds, Jesse, and this is the curious thing. Imagine, if you will, this woman is face down, as he reported, in bed, hands up like this, you know, like you can imagine. Maybe many of us have slept like that at some point in time, small children particularly. She's lying in bed, face down in a prone position, and it's easy to kind of access a defenseless person in this manner, because the back you can either place your hand between their shoulder blades and hold them down, or you can straddle. And then the concentration of these wounds would give you an indication that they are all in close proximity. He's driving this knife down through the back area where the ribs, kind of originate. And what's so painful about this, Jesse, is the fact that some of these probably penetrated her lungs. When he's talking about the blood that's beneath the body, what begins to happen during this process, which we refer to as a perimortem process, that means in the throes of death, she is literally coughing up blood because her lungs are being struck posteriorly or in the rear. So all of this is kind of traveling into her airway. She's spitting up the blood, and it's a very it's a horrible way to die. I don't like to use the term drowning in your own blood, but the lungs become very, very heavy, congested, and you literally not just bleed out, but you go into congestive failure.
What it sounds like to me is that somebody in this condition, they wouldn't be able to fight back.
No, they wouldn't, and you can't. It's implausible, to think that someone could, unless you could, kind of move around and wrist them off of your back, which, she's so struck at this point in time that she's just in kind of survival mode if she has an awareness that she has been struck by the knife. The forensics individual here, Vandenberg, actually did a very nice job talking about postmortem interval, which ties back to this length of time that has transpired since the event took place. And this is something we spend a lot of time doing in medical legal death investigation, since the event took place, which is the fatal event, to the point in which she was observed by the authorities. He's talking about the body going out of rigor mortis. She's got skin slippage. He's talking about the degree of lividity that's on her face, how livid it is and dark, and that means that the blood is pooling. And there are specific benchmarks in time scientifically that we can tie back that kind of link all this stuff together. So they're painting a very dynamic picture, and actually, within certain parameters, a very accurate picture.
And the heinous nature of this crime will definitely come into play during Nicholas Godejohn's sentencing, which may be on Friday. But let's take a quick break, and when we come back, you know what we're going to do? We're going to hear from the words of the killer himself, Nicholas Godejohn, in his police interrogation tape. We'll be right back.
So when you say 4 actual stabs, so those are the ones that went in deeper?
Yeah.
Was there some little ones? Or?
There might have been, because the truth is that I counted the ones that went in deep. I didn't count if there's any other ones.
Okay. So if there's any other ones, you just didn't count those because they didn't go in as deep?
Yeah.
Okay. But you know that 4 of them went in deep?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know where those 4 deep ones were? Are you counting the one in the back of the neck or not in that 4?
No.
Okay, so the back of the neck would be something different.
Yeah.
Very chilling to hear a killer describing the attack. Joseph, I want to get more into the story now, though. So he claims almost that he's the hero in the way that he tried to save Gypsy from her mother, DeeDee Blanchard, who, after the story broke, people said that she really suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, in which she created these fake symptoms for her daughter. I'm curious your perspective on this and how it's played out in your career.
What's really curious about it, Jesse, is that with Munchausen's, most of the time it applies to younger children who are taken by their mom and used essentially as a prop in order to glean attention and this sort of thing from the public at large. It's rare that you would see a person in advanced age like Gypsy that would still be engaged in this, because by this time you have this kind of ability, this cognitive ability to form a rationale or an understanding of right and wrong and all these sorts of things. But in her defense, it's kind of the only reality she's known. In my particular instance, I've worked cases involving mothers who have done fatal harm to children in order to elicit sympathy from others. There are any number of stories out there. I reflect back to a case out of New York from many years ago. It was actually featured on 60 Minutes, where a lady had killed multiple small children and had kind of flown under the radar for all of these years, and claiming that the children had died of SIDS. And you look at this as just living your normal life, and you see these people that will actually take advantage of somebody that's incapable of defending themselves and use them as a prop, like I like to say, so that they can have personal gain from it.
It's a bizarre set of circumstances, and we keep always asking, like, who's the victim? Was it DeeDee? Was it Gypsy? Was it Nicholas? Let's continue on with his police interrogation tape, and we can learn more of the details about how this all unfolded and just a larger story in general.
How did you get from the hotel to her house?
By a taxi.
Okay, so you had a taxi pick you up at the hotel and drop you off at her house?
Yes.
And what day was that? Do you remember?
It was in the morning. I believe it was on the 10th, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, on the morning. So you went there, and is that the day that you killed Dee?
Yes.
At the same time, so the taxi brings you from the hotel to her house. And what's Dee doing? Does she care that you're there?
She is not even aware that I'm there because she is sleeping at the time.
Okay, so do you go into the house, or does Gypsy come outside, or how does that work?
She let me in.
She let you in the house?
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever go in that shed?
Shed.
There's like a shed on that property?
Oh, no.
Okay, didn't go in there. Did you ever get in their vehicle?
No.
That vehicle there. So you get dropped off by the taxi, and Gypsy lets you in?
Yep.
Okay. And when you get there, do you already know that you're going to kill Dee?
I pretty much, at that point, I made my mind up that it's the only option at that point.
Okay.
So I just went right for it, and I had a latex glove on and something like that.
Okay.
So to try to hide my fingerprints.
Okay. Did you bring the latex gloves?
No, she provided them for me.
Okay. So when you get there, you put the gloves on?
Yes.
Okay, you put the gloves on outside the house or inside the house?
Inside, no, It was outside of the house, but as I was walking in, I had him just.
So did you and her talk outside before you went in the house?
I did whisper, because it was part of our plan, and she's the one that thought of that part of the plan.
Okay.
I told her to get her back into the bathroom because that's what she wanted to do, and I wanted her to get to it right away because I wanted to get this over with and get out of there as soon as possible.
Okay. So when you get there, she has the latex gloves or the gloves. What color are they?
They're like a cross between like a bluish green. It's like, it's almost like a turquoise color almost.
Okay. Did she give you one glove, two gloves?
Two.
Okay. So you put the gloves on, and then what do you do?
After that, she hands me the knife, and then I take care of the rest.
Now, does she have gloves on her hands when she hands you the knife, or not?
Her fingerprints are on the knife.
Her fingerprints will be on the knife?
Yes.
Okay. Because she didn't have gloves on then, huh?
Yes.
Okay. So she hands you the knife.
Yes.
And then what happens?
Then she goes straight into the bathroom, locks the door, and she waits for my signal to let her know that everything's clear.
And the signal was the 3 knocks?
You know, Joseph, as we watch this, we were just talking about his demeanor in this police interrogation tape, and we can't forget that the defense went with the theory of saying he is an autistic individual who was manipulated by DeeDee Blanchard. But one of the criticisms of that argument throughout this whole case is, doesn't it kind of ignore the realities of autism, and it kind of places these assumptions that might not be true, because again, he was convicted of first-degree murder, and he may very well spend the rest of his life in prison, and the idea is that he did understand what he did. So I'm curious your thoughts on this defense put forward by his attorneys.
Yeah, you watch this interaction with the detective here, and he's talking in terms of the complexity of the case, and he has specific memory to time and space and the planning that goes into this, and also what's really kind of interesting for me, Jesse, looking at this guy and listening to him, he's talking about the killing of this woman and how he's in close proximity to her body. This is a very bloody scene. He's in a very intimate setting. This is not something that you would normally see kind of manifested. I don't think to any degree as the psychiatrists refer to, the spectrum of autism. He's able to, kind of describe and detail these complex relationships. And timing is really curious, and being able to travel over great distances, and leave familiar surroundings is just out of the norm relative to an individual diagnosed with autism.
But then, as one of our guests said from yesterday, what else were they going to argue? They have him on tape admitting to this, and he hasn't even denied it. So what exactly should their argument have been? We're going to take a break, and when we come back, you just heard from Nicholas Godejohn. You know who you're going to hear from next? DeeDee Blanchard, when she took the stand for the defense in his trial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our discussion and our analysis of the Nicholas Godejohn trial in light of the fact he may be sentenced on Friday. And we just played you his police interrogation tape where he admitted to killing DeeDee Blanchard. So when the defense got handed the case in his trial, they wanted to shift the blame from Nicholas and say, really, who was the mastermind behind all of this? DeeDee Blanchard, his girlfriend, the daughter of the person he killed. And so what happened, their first witness that they call out is DeeDee Blanchard, and I'll say this once, I'll say it again. First thing I want you to note is how different she looks in that courtroom compared to all of the years she was under the care of her mother. Watch.
In June of 2015, were you in a wheelchair?
Yes.
Did Nick know you were in a wheelchair?
Yes.
Why were you in a wheelchair in June of 2015?
Because my mother forced me to be in one.
Do you know why you were forced to be in a wheelchair?
No, sir. She just forced me to be in one.
And how long had you been in a wheelchair as of June of 2015?
Since probably I was about 8 years old.
Was there a time between when you first were put in a wheelchair and June of 2015 that you figured out that you really didn't need to be in a wheelchair?
Yes.
When was that?
I always knew that I didn't need the wheelchair
And how did you know that?
because I could walk.
Did you and your mother obtain any kind of advantage by you being in a wheelchair?
Yes, sir.
What kind of advantage did you obtain?
Financial, attention, charity.
Financially mean money.
Yes, sir.
Did you obtain money as a result of you being in a wheelchair?
Yes, sir.
How did that work out? How did that happen?
Judge, I'm going to object to the relevance of that. There's been no connection that the defendant knew any of this.
Well, I'm assuming, Mr. Perry, you're going to tie this up.
Well, right now. Did you and Nick ever talk about the fact that you didn't need to be in a wheelchair?
Yes.
Did you ever talk to him about why you were required to be in a wheelchair?
Yes.
I'll overrule the objection.
Did you ever run away?
Yes, sir.
When did you, and by run away I mean from your mother,
Yes, sir.
when did you run away?
In the spring of 2011.
Did you tell Nick about that?
Yes, sir.
When did you tell Nick about that?
I don't remember the exact time.
Was it before your mother's murder?
Yes.
Did you ever consider running away after that? After you ran away in 2011?
Yes, but I knew that it would end badly.
What happened when you ran away? Tell us about running away in 2011.
It was in the middle of the night, and I packed a small bag of stuff, and my mother was asleep, so I left the house, and I met up with one of my friends
And where did you go?
to first at Mercy Hospital in Springfield, and then to his house.
And at some point, did your mom figure out where you were?
Yes, sir.
And when was that?
4 hours later,
What happened when your mother figured out where you were?
she took me back home. She smashed my computer and my cell phone. She chained me to a bed for 2 weeks.
That's DeeDee Blanchard, the co-defendant, explaining how she planned with Nicholas Godejohn to kill her mother, talks about the horrible life she had under the care of her mother. But again, one of the most interesting things to see is just watching her. She has hair. She looks a lot different. She is not confined to a wheelchair. She walked into that courtroom very different than years ago, where she was made to believe that she was very, very sick. Let's continue on with her on the stand, and now she's going to get into really whose idea was to do the exact stabbing. This becomes an important point, and let's watch it right now.
And what was going on in your home life that made you reach the point where you did that or made that decision?
I was growing increasingly desperate to get out of my home life.
Did you tell Nick that?
Yes.
And what was your mom doing that caused you to be more desperate?
Things were getting physically and more physically abusive. The hitting was more. The starving was more.
Now, you mentioned you were in a wheelchair. Were you required to act in a certain way when you were in a wheelchair?
Yes, sir.
How was that?
She would have me stay very quiet and pretend like I couldn't walk.
Mr. Perry, can we pause for a second?
When the defendant agreed to kill your mom, at some point he told you that he also wanted to rape her.
Yes, sir.
You did not want the defendant to rape your mom, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, in leaving the decision of how to kill her up to the defendant, you never told him to stab her 17 separate times, right?
No.
And you certainly didn't tell him to cut her neck down to the bone, right?
No.
And when he asked you about raping your mother, you actually talked him out of it, right?
Yes.
And you did so by offering the alternative that he would be able to rape you after the murder, correct?
That's correct.
All right, Joseph, what do you make of this pair, this duo who went together, they met, came up with a plan to kill her mother, but you hear kind of the prosecution really putting the emphasis on Nicholas Godejohn, that he's the one who wanted to stab and even, threw out the idea of raping DeeDee Blanchard. So this idea of this dual team going together to commit this crime, what do you make of that?
Well, when they start getting off into rape fantasies and this sort of thing, it kind of implies, at least, that she's trading one monster for another at that point in time. And relative to her, she lives in this very contracted state, defenseless and this sort of thing, and in a wheelchair, confined in this environment, and going to great lengths to try to plan a way out at this sort of point in time. And let's keep in mind, her choices were very, very limited, and she kind of had to throw the bait out, if you will, on this Christian dating site in order to attract somebody. So you really wonder about her motivations for, engaging with this fellow. Was she just looking for a way out, or was she actually looking for love in this environment? And it turned out to be a very toxic combination.
In your opinion, who do you think the victim is here? Is it DeeDee Blanchard, obviously the actual victim? She was killed. But was it Gypsy? Was it Nicholas? Was he manipulated? Was she manipulated? Who do you think the actual victim is in this whole case?
Well, obviously, since we're talking about the homicide of this woman, she's going to be our primary victim in this particular case. And her reputation is put on trial, and I say this over and over again. The one thing about the dead is they can't defend themselves.
Right.
And so, moving forward with that construct, you're left just to kind of judge the sum total by what remains. That is Gypsy and Godejohn. And it's a very bleak picture. I think that there's probably kind of this triangulation that's going on where everybody's using one another to their own benefit. There's nobody that comes out of this thing with clean skirts.
That's a really good point, and it's just a horrible story any which way you look at it. The reason we're talking about it is, again, we believe Nicholas Godejohn may be sentenced on Friday if the judge does not grant his defense's motion for a new trial. We are going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to switch cases, and we're going to focus on California in the McStay family murder case, the trial of Charles Merritt. We'll be right back.